Our reading for tonight comes from Matthew, and I picked the reading tonight because it is one of the readings that has been used in the long history of anti-Semitism as a reason for communities of Christian faith to denounce Jews, to call people that are Jewish those who killed Jesus. And I think if we read it with that lens, we can see it. We can see it that way if you want to read it that way. How we, as Christians, should read it is noticing the brokenness of all people and identifying our own brokenness in this reading. It comes from Matthew chapter 27. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So we at American Lutheran Church know that Luther himself was saint and sinner, and that we do well not to place him on a pedestal as if he was free from fault in the eyes of God or the eyes of the church or the eyes of humanity. Because along with the Mighty Fortress and the Small Catechism and all of these hymns that we sing, a whole bunch of sermons, a lot of writings that so clearly state God's love and grace for us. In illness at the end of his life, Luther also wrote a tract titled "The Jews and Their Lies." It was a complete 180 from where the younger, healthier Luther had been. Earlier in his career, he'd actually been seen writing and preaching as too favorable to the Jewish people. He argued that you don't blame Jewish people for rejecting the church when you see how the church has treated them like dogs. Why should the Jewish people like the church? We treat them like dogs. Who would want to join that, he would argue in his writings. And then again, he was found for praising those of Jewish faith because at least they were knowledgeable and committed to the teachings and writings of the Old Testament and to the God that inspired it. He wrote, "It was more than he could say for a lot of folks in the church, especially the priests, who seemed to neglect the Bible entirely." So early on, he views the Jewish people as allies, joining together in a call to name the sins of the papal church. But what changed? Well, what changes people? Power and politics and pride. You remember, as Luther was leading this Reformation, how important it was for the Lutheran Church to find electors that would sponsor his call. You had to have princes, electors, mayors of small towns, university leaders that were all sources of power because the church was trying to silence him. When you're standing up to the richest institution in the world, you need a bankroll yourself. So with the company and the companionship of the rich and the powerful came the agendas of the rich and the powerful. And anti-Judaism was a tenet of power. Though they were always a small population in Europe, others always assigned the Jewish community an absurd percentage of power, which in reality didn't exist, but it made them a good common enemy. And the easiest way to band together is to have a common enemy. It's easy to scapegoat when the majority of the community feels disempowered, to find a small group and blame them. So slowly these anti-Judaic ideas went from the elector's agenda to becoming Luther's agenda. First, it was a matter of power and politics, but then it became a matter of pride. Just as Luther had said, they're people of faith, they're not people of my faith, but they're at least really good at what they're doing. Once Luther had started his own movement and had his own writings, his pride took over, and he was offended. What do you mean you don't want the God I offer? I understand you don't want the Catholic one, but what do you mean you don't want my God? And so he wrote these horrendous tracts, and they were pure awful. In short, Martin Luther was written about by scholar Martin Marty saying this: the once uncertain monk in these kinds of cases had become so comfortable with his certitude. The monk who didn't know anything now thought he knew everything, that it took on the character of the very self-centered security, the intellectual and moral self-assurance against which he'd always warned. And it served as his license to threaten others. The apostle of Christian freedom was not free from his own prejudice. The biblical scholar and spiritual struggler who preached that like Jacob, he had prevailed over God and man in this display, showed that he had not conquered his own worst self. Saint and sinner always. And so one of the tenets of Lutheran worship that we're lifting up this year is confession and forgiveness. A reminder that we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. The Luther that we celebrate is a Luther that preached freedom, but also the man we know is one that was captive to sin. We cannot free ourselves. It's well documented that those in Luther's circle struggled or outright rejected his later writings on the Jews. And that's important to note. His closest friends and fellow preachers literally publicly held their nose. They were very bodily people. There's a lot of Luther's writings that were very bodily. But they would go out and hold their nose at the garbage their friend was producing. Even more powerfully, it is written down that Luther's wife, a former nun, would angrily quote scripture at him in Latin after he'd go on a rant against the Jews. She would clearly proclaim God's love for all people, so much so that Luther would cower and retreat. That in and of itself is amazing. But the fact that a man wrote down a woman's words 500 years ago, the words of a spouse silencing her husband because of her better theological argument, is amazing. So like Luther, our worst sin is that we are aware of our own captivity. And when we are, we try to capture others and exert power over them, to rule over them, because our biggest fear is being on the bottom. So like Luther's contemporaries and Luther's wife, it's important to name this sin and our own part in it. And tonight I want to share with you how our church did just that. It's one of the most beautiful declarations I've ever read. It's not like I read 1,000 declarations, but I've read a couple. And it's just so beautiful. It's a declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to the Jewish community, first adopted in 1994. And I'm going to read it as a whole because it was intended as a whole, and it matters. In the long history of the church, the treatment accorded the Jewish people by Christians has been amongst our most grievous and shameful legacies. Very few Christian communities of faith were able to escape the contagion of anti-Judaism and its modern successor, anti-Semitism. Lutherans belonging to the Lutheran World Federation and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America feel a special burden in this regard because of certain elements in the legacy of the reformer Martin Luther and the catastrophes, including the Holocaust of the 20th century, that was suffered by Jews in places where Lutheran churches were strongly represented. The Lutheran communion of faith is linked by name and heritage to the memory of Martin Luther, teacher and reformer. Honoring his name and our own, we recalled his bold stand for truth, his earthly and sublime words of wisdom, and above all, his witness to God's saving word. Luther proclaimed a gospel for people who, as we really are, bidding us to trust a grace sufficient to reach our own deepest shames and address the most tragic truths. So in that spirit of truth-telling, we who bear his name and heritage must with pain acknowledge also Luther's anti-Judaic diatribes and the violent recommendations of his later writings against the Jews. As did many of Luther's own companions in the 16th century, we reject this violent invective. And yet more do we express our deep and abiding sorrow over its tragic effects on subsequent generations. In concert with the Lutheran World Federation, we particularly deplore the appropriation in our day of Luther's words by modern anti-Semites for the teaching of hatred and the incitement of violence towards Judaism and the Jewish people. Grieving the complicity of our own tradition within the history of hatred, moreover, we express our urgent desire to live out our faith in Jesus Christ with love and respect for the Jewish people. We recognize in anti-Semitism a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, a violation of our hope and calling. And we pledge this church to oppose the deadly working of such bigotry, both within our own circles and in the society around us. Finally, we pray for the continued blessing of the Blessed One upon the increasing cooperation and understanding between Lutheran Christians and the Jewish community. That's how it's done. We name our history. We take responsibility in our history. We see how it's being played out in today, the privilege we have afforded because of the hate that we have been party to, and the hate that is being done in our name. And so we recognize that anti-Semitism is a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, that it changes who we are. It's not a statement about who they are. Anti-Semitism is a statement about who we are. And for that, we apologize. I've been working at church all day. I haven't watched the news. I haven't looked much at social media. But in the 3 minutes I had, I saw a video today of a PhD student being arrested off the street by unarmed or unmarked agents. Grieving the complicity of our own tradition within this history of hatred. Moreover, we express our desire, our urgent desire, to live out our faith in Jesus Christ with love and respect for all people. I don't want history to say the same about us. I don't want our kids to have to apologize for our staying silent or for our watching. I give thanks that God has called us together in this place into a community that believes in caring for one another. And for American Lutheran Church, that means for all people. And no one can say we are doing anything less than trying our best. Amen.